All right, everybody, welcome back to another class. This time I'm really excited. We're joined by B. Eldridge. She's a doctoral student at University College London, and she is here to talk about her Disney fandom and her research background, where she focuses on Disney princesses and the representation of motherhood in those movies. And before we started recording, we were talking about some other things. So there's 4 or 5 other topics that I want to get to. But I first want to start and focus in on her primary work. So B, thank you and welcome. Can you first kind of walk us through, give us the introduction to your fandom, walk us through today, and include why you research what you research?
Sure. My fandom is sort of just the whole of Disney for the majority of it. I love Disney villains in particular, but I think just all of Disney is fabulous to look at and to study because there's just so many amazing things out there to look at Disney. But like I said, I love the villains, and I love looking at villains who've been queer coded, particularly, and villains who are mothers. And my doctoral research focuses on the wicked stepmother figure, and I look at, in previous works, I've looked at in general just sort of the evil stepmother, Lady Tremaine, the wicked stepmother. I've looked at adoptive mothers like Frau Gretel and Rapunzel and all of that, and why these characters are villainous, and these other mothers, as a lot of us deem them, are seen as villainous, and their biological versus non-biological status, and what that has to do with this villainous portrayal. So yeah, that's sort of where I am today. I kind of started doing all of that good stuff when I was getting my master's degree at the University of Edinburgh, and then it led me to looking at Jungian archetypes and the mother archetype in particular, and how that appeared in fairy tales, and then that led me to Disney and my PhD.
Nice, very nice. Thank you. To jump right in, the first question I have is really it's not just in Disney, it's in uh kind of popular culture entertainment. What was the kind of foundation for using um especially stepmothers as like a villain? Do can you tell us anything about that from the research you've done?
So that actually has a bit more of a history behind it, not necessarily in popular culture, but in fairy tales, right? So that's where my
Hmm.
primary background is in fairy tales. And what we saw with the Brothers Grimm, who were collectors of sorts, I mainly call them editors of fairy tales because they took fairy tales and edited them for the collection. And what they did was they actually took tales like Snow White, and they made the biological mother a stepmother. So they added that extra step in there on purpose to separate the child reader, the child audience, from the biological mother possibly being evil to the stepmother. So that was part of that transition in the fairy tale's lifespan, because there's no such thing as an original fairy tale, but I try and tell everyone they stem from oral tradition, and this is sort of where they were at. And so the Grimms, as they wrote them down, they kind of solidified their versions, but they edited them so much that we actually get a bunch of different versions. But yeah, so that's sort of where that wicked stepmother trope came from in the Grimm version of fairy tales. And what we
Could I
then,
jump in real quick? Sorry.
yeah, go right
I'm
ahead. No.
I'm gonna forget if I don't. Does that, you said it comes from oral history.
Mhm.
Does that have anything to do with like the progression of growing up when a child is younger? They think their parents can do no wrong. And then
Right.
at a certain point in their life, when they're after they've, matured a little bit or just had different life experiences, we kind of accept that, parents are humans. They do things that maybe we don't like. They make mistakes. But that kind of taking the maybe the negative aspects of the biological mother or the biological parent and putting them into the stepmother role.
Mhm.
Do you think that has anything to do with kind of that progression of storytelling and everything?
I think it it has a progression to it of social culture and like societal discourse at the time period. There's this notion that a biological parent was better because a
Mm,
biological mother survived, right? Because especially back in, Germany in the 1800s, there was a high mortality rate for mothers. And so we had a lot of blended families and we have them today. And so the stepmother was given all these negative aspects. That way the child they weren't as essentially frightened by this notion because
okay.
the original villain in the Grimm's, so the Grimm's have an 1810 draft of their collection that was found in a monastery of all places. And what we see in that draft is the Snow White villain, the villain in the Snow White tale is actually a biological mother. And she's
Okay.
just called Mother. So she's just that's it. She's just the mother, the biological whatever. In 1819, they changed it to the stepmother. And a lot of scholars have argued that was because the brothers Grimm held their own biological mother in such high regard that they
Hmm.
purposely did that separation. And so if they held their biological mother in such high regard, they wanted to ensure, hey, that's what stayed. And so it kind of just entered into circulation at that point, and that's sort of where that trope kind of comes from. I can't definitively say that's exactly where it comes from, but at least in the world of the Grimm tales, that's where it comes from.
Okay. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Thank you for that. Um, so so keep going with your discussion, please.
Yeah, sure. So what we then saw was the Grimms took the biological part out of the stepmother and they continued, and then that's sort of how the tale was. And then Disney saw the tale and was like, great, we have a wicked stepmother and we have a princess, and he loved the tale. Disney actually saw the film Snow White done by Winthrop Ames in 1916 in Kansas City.
Okay.
He actually, that was the first time he saw Snow White. It was actually based on a play that Winthrop Ames did as well in 1912, but Disney saw the film version of it and saw Marguerite Clark playing Snow White. And that's actually the basis for his Snow White was Marguerite Clark's version of it. And so we get that. And then that stepmother trope just sort of stayed and it just kind of kept on remaining. And we have this trope of the wicked stepmother that's been around now for, I mean, eons. You look back in time, there's stepmothers everywhere, and they're just portrayed in a negative light.
Hmm.
And I couldn't tell you where exactly that comes from, but that's part of our culture and society, and it definitely impacts stepmothers in blended families.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's that's so interesting to look at, and like the impact of entertainment, the
Hmm.
impact and influence of the Walt Disney Company. I mean, this is the 100th year anniversary of the company. So obviously, a company that's been around that long obviously has a very big impact on society.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's extremely, extremely interesting. So what's your particular focus when you look at motherhood and the portrayal of motherhood in the Disney projects?
So I usually look at the princess to the mother dichotomy with a focus on the mother. 'Cause a lot of other research has focused specifically more on the princess in that dichotomy and the impact that mother has on the princess. But I look at the mother and the impact that she has had with society, with the princess, and with that. So I make her the main character when I'm studying these things. So I look at them as her tales. So the Grimm's version, there is no primary character. It's told from a third person sort of omniscient voice. So there is no primary character. It's just sort of like a surveyor of the tales. And for some reason, the princess has been the focus. But many scholars, when it comes to Snow White, have argued that it's about Snow White and the stepmother, and particularly with focus on the stepmother, because in the tales and in the films, she gets more attention, more of the light, more of the focus. She's the more popular character, especially in Disney's film. She was a more popular character. She was more active. She just lit up the screen when she was on it, essentially.
Yeah.
And so I look at the impact of society at the time period, so like the 1930s. What was the stepmother like? If there's not a whole lot of research there, okay, what was the negative aspect of the mother figure? Why were they given to the wicked stepmother? What was the 1930s society going on? We had the Great Depression, the New Deal era. So I look at all of that sort of stuff within my PhD. And then beyond that, I look at other forms of motherhood. So like adoptive mothers, stepmothers with children from previous marriages. So that gives you Frau Goethe and Lady Tremaine. And I look at how they're all three of these mother figures from Grimhilda to Frau Goethe and Lady Tremaine, they all have really interesting aspects of being older, right? Because they're supposed to be mother figures, but particularly with Gretel and Grimhilda, we see them actually age and wither away
Hmm.
in the film. So while Grimhilda falls off a cliff in the version of a crone, Grimhilda actually withers into sand and disappears. So we see this ageist sort of portrayal, and I look at what that means for older moms. What does that mean? Why is that a bad thing? Why is aging as a mom bad? Where do we start to see that age sort of happen with live action actresses? So why at that age are they perceived as old? Why is it like 35 women are perceived as old
Hmm.
and then they're killed off? Or why is it that the mother who lives is the mother who becomes a villain, whereas the mother who dies is heralded as good? So that's sort of all the aspects I look into from the different areas of motherhood and the sort of area that I focus on. And then I also do queer studies and ageist studies as well.
So I tried to make mental notes of everything. First, and I'll probably forget things. I apologize. The
Okay.
In your research, do you think that the reason a mother that has passed away is kind of heralded or held up in high regards compared to the stepmother is because, like, does that have to do with anything like people's memories? People tend to remember things in a certain perspective, and they're not interacting with this person in real time or in current time. They're interacting with someone who is, the stepmother, who is probably telling them they can't do things, they can't, they trying to help them through life, so they're upset about that.
Mhm.
So then therefore, like, they get the negativity placed on them, whereas the parent who's no longer around, who's passed away, they kind of get held up in this positive light.
Right. I think that's a part of it. And what we do see that in I think in Red we see the mom and daughter interactions really well, but that's with the biological parent, right? And they're young and there's no death threats, right? But with the Disney princess films in particular, what we see is that the mother who passes away is heralded because there's only good memories.
Hmm.
I think a non-Disney film that looks at that interaction is Rupert Saunders's version of Snow White, which is Snow White and the Huntsman. And it's only about 5 minutes of screen time, if that. I actually think it's like 3 minutes and 10 seconds or something. We see Snow White interact with her biological mother. And within that, they're kind of played like memories, and it's past interactions. It's things that barely take up the screen, but every interaction is positive and it's delightful. It's not Snow White as a teenager with the hormones
Yeah.
and everything and what that comes with and that complication that you have with your biological mother, right? When you're going through that stage in your life, or we don't even see like complicated relationships with biological mothers in Disney Princess. I
Yeah.
mean, I shouldn't say that. Merida, you do.
Yeah.
Merida, you get more of a complex with that. And within Maleficent, so some of the newer films you do, but in the older films, you don't, because the biological mother just doesn't exist. Even in Sleeping Beauty, she's asleep with everyone else. She's gone off in the castle while Aurora's in the woods with the three fairies. Um, so yeah, there's definitely a part of that where you get that nostalgia and only the princess remembering the good things. And then when the princess is around the teenage years, which is where a lot of these older animated Disney films come from, we see the stepmother, we see the negative impact of that relationship, and we never see that with the, I can say never. We don't see that with the biological mother in these older animated films.
Yeah.
We're starting to see that, which is great. I think that's some positive steps that Disney is taking. But I think in the older Disney tales, it was mainly about really contrasting that comparison of the good princess and the villainous queen stepmother figure that were in battle for the role of, the main character, the mother figure, the some people argue it was, the sexual desire for the prince and all that kind of stuff. So that's what we actually end up seeing is more of a combatant of between the two.
Yeah. And is it in any way like does the stepmother in any way represent or is an analogy for just kind of the princess in or any teenager learning how to live in their surrounding world? Like with all of the pressures and all of the things that a person can do or can't do in a world, was the stepmother ever used in a story to kind of represent all of that and sort of focus in on kind of the constraints of growing up?
I don't know actually, because I've never quite looked at it from that perspective. Like I said, I mainly look at it from the motherhood perspective.
Hmm.
Um, but I know Snow White has been talked about in that way, in that um, Snow White is aging into maturity, whereas the stepmother is essentially aging out of maturity
Hmm.
and becoming menopausal and that sort of thing. And so then there's that aspect of it. But I've never actively looked at it as a representation of like the teen angst and the representation of maybe like society being harder on the woman. What I've actually seen more so is the princess is being, I don't want to say groomed because that's not the appropriate word, but trained to be the good mother by the
Yeah.
male figures in the film. That's more what I see because up into, I mean, we don't really get a strong Disney princess until the 80s, I want to say, with Black Cauldron, and that one's even forgot about, which I think is funny. But most of the Disney princesses we get before then are very passive, and they don't
Yeah.
really have enough angst within them to act out in any sort of manner. Um, so I think Red is the first film that really does that really well from Disney
Okay.
Pixar combination. I don't think any of the other ones. I mean, Inside Out, or I'm sorry, is that what it is? Inside Out, the one with the emotions.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that one I think does a great job at showing the emotional regulation of a teenage girl who's going under a lot of pressure from moving to a new city and becoming, older, and the relationship that she has with her mom. She screams at her sometimes, and that sometimes you just have to be sad as a kid. I think that's
Yeah.
a really good portrayal from Inside. So I think those two films are better, more so than the Disney princess line.
Yeah. And you know that Inside Out is one of my favorite Pixar movies,
Yeah,
because
it's a
of
good one.
the representation of just kind of interpersonal and psychology and between
Yeah.
people and within a person.
Hmm.
On the topic of Snow White in particular,
Yeah.
um, have you ever read Fairest of All, A Tale of the Wicked Queen by
I have, yeah.
yeah, that I listen to a lot of audiobooks. So I listened to that as part of Serena Valentino's A Wicked collection.
Hmm.
And that story in particular is, I think, just the loveliest story of the way that it's told and the way that she was able to take this character who the only attention
Hmm.
she ever gets in Snow White, at
Right.
least the Disney version, is just negative attention.
Hmm.
And it was so, listening to that story, it was so heartbreaking to see, like, just listening to it, I knew, well, eventually she's going to make the turn, and eventually she's going to make the heel turn. And it doesn't happen until very, very late, extremely late in the story, that, you
Mm-hmm.
know, I thought that did a very, very good job of kind of telling, not from the mother's perspective, in my opinion, telling, like, from her perspective, how she kind of moved to this place. And it wasn't all necessarily because of Snow White, who, you know, throughout the book, she talks about how much she loves the child. It was for kind of outside reasons and things that were happening to her from the outside world. So what are your thoughts on that? And are there other stories or representate, or are there other stories that have represented the stepmother in a different light than maybe the early Disney movies did?
So I'll go with Valentino first. I did read that book. It was originally going to be part of my PhD, but it couldn't fit in. While I found it interesting to be a tale from the stepmother's perspective, I actually found a lot of issues with the representation of the stepmother
Okay.
figure, particularly because she has a background of abuse. She comes from an abusive home,
Hmm.
mentally abusive, emotionally abusive, and then it haunts her throughout. So my primary issue with that story is that it shows that a person who comes from an abusive home will only make an abusive parent.
Okay.
That is
Yeah.
my primary issue with that story. While I found the ending very interesting, an interesting take that the stepmother, spoiler alert for those who haven't read it, the ending is that she's in the mirror and Snow White is looking at her in the mirror and telling her how much she loves her. I found that very interesting, but what I found what could have been even more better is if the queen survived and she could have been there in person discussing it, and they could
Hmm.
have been there in person healing the wounds that the stepmother obtained from her previous life. And so while I think it was an interesting idea to try and show how there's background to the character and bring it into the Disney line, to me there was a lot of disconnect as well, because it's like the final 20 pages she finally becomes the queen that we know in the
Hmm.
film, and it's a way to incorporate the film into the book. And it just felt very out of character, even if as you follow this character down the path that they're taking and through their mental illness, because that's what it is, it's a representation of mental illness. What you end up finding is, at some point, I think I wrote in the margins that this doesn't even sound like the character anymore, which it's not supposed to. It's supposed
Yeah.
to be that change in character, but it's to a point where it's almost an immediate flip, and it's not like a slow flip. But that's a personal um, note on that. But overall, yeah, I found it to be an interesting idea, but I didn't like that particular aspect because it's just showing the stepmother again as a villain who was unredeemable. And people who come from abusive backgrounds are going to look at that and be like, oh, maybe I can't be a good parent because I come from that background. And that's not okay. Like, they need to have positive representation as well. Um, so that was my primary issue. And then other stories with the stepmother, I know that Disney recently released Disenchanted, which
Hmm.
was the follow-up to Enchanted. Have not seen it all the way yet. It's on my to watch list, but I know she takes on the role of the
Hmm.
stepmother. And knowing Disney, I don't know how it ends. I'm just guessing how it ends. That it ends happily ever after. Because it is a Disney film. So I'm hoping that one we have some positive representation. But I know things like Disney TV shows, descendants, there's a lot of problems with the
Hmm.
representation of the stepmother figures or the mother figures at that point in time. They're mother figures instead of stepmother figures, which is very confusing. Um, there's a lot of problems with that and the representation between the two. And I don't think I can think of a positive stepmother relationship that Disney does. Um, from my understanding of the Disney corpus, I honestly can't think of one.
Okay. Okay. Um, And so you also had mentioned ageism,
Yes.
that, you mentioned a few examples of the stepmother. You see the stepmother aging, you see the
Hmm.
stepmother age or wither away and die. Um, and you mentioned, in your research, you've looked at what in society was going on at that time. Um, so what was the corollary between what was going on in contemporary society in the
Hmm.
30s and 40s, 20s, 30s, 40s, and those stories that were being told, or I should say maybe the tropes that the wicked stepmother um becomes more wicked when they become
Yeah.
older.
Hmm.
What were the corollaries between that?
So with the 30s in particular, what I found fascinating was that women went, we had the Great Depression. So the household, the understanding of the heteronormative American household was placed under duress because men were laid off first during the Great Depression and women went to work. Women were impacted eventually during the Great Depression. But then we had the New Deal era, and what that did was really fascinating because what we ended up seeing was the enactment of, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting what it is called. Oh, that's terrible. Essentially what we now know today as derogatorily know it as my brain is going blank. I am so sorry.
That's
It's
okay.
the welfare system. So
Okay.
what we know derogatorily as the welfare system was actually established in the 1930s
Okay.
under the New Deal era. And it was the aid to families with children, I believe is what it was called, or the aid to dependent families with children, the ADFC. And what that did was basically women could apply for aid from the government to help them take care of their children. However, women who were widows were actually given preference, and they have the statistics. Widowed
Okay.
women were given more money because their husbands died on them. They didn't leave them, they weren't unwed. Most of the time, if mothers were unwed or the husband left, they had a much harder time getting aid from the government.
Hmm.
Um, so that was really fascinating because the New Deal era sort of this aid to dependent families, or yeah, aid dependent families, ADS, with children. Sorry. What
No
we
worries.
saw, yeah, what we saw was that they defined what it meant to be a good mother. And they needed that definition to provide these mothers with financial aid. And women were essentially then the mother figure was forced to conform if they wanted that aid. Gwendolyn
Okay.
Mink is she's a historian who's written a lot about this. Um, and so she says that, it was a means of conformity for women at that point in time. If you didn't conform to their idea of good mother, you were not a good mother. And back then, a good mother was young, she was married, she had 2.5 kids in a house,
Hmm.
she didn't work. She didn't run a kingdom by herself. She was, the children were her biological children. They were not
Yeah.
stepchildren. And so what we then see in the 1937 film, Grimhilda, the king isn't mentioned once at all throughout the entire film. He is not mentioned. We know there's a king because Snow White exists. We know there was a mom because Snow White exists. However, we know that it's not the wicked stepmother. And so what's really fascinating then is that even though the king and biological mother are not mentioned, we are aware of their existence. And Grimhilda is running the kingdom by herself. She has no king. She's running it all. She has her own adversary, or not adversary, but she has the mirror who tells her information that she needs, her confidant, and she has the huntsman. And that's it. It's a very small kingdom, apparently. And what we later find out in the film when Snow White is actually picking flowers before the huntsman scares her away is that she asks the bird, "Are you an orphan too?" So there's this assumption that the king and queen are dead
Yeah.
and that Grimhilda is running this kingdom by herself. She's making Snow White do chores. She's, the castle is only pristine because of the child's work. The queen doesn't work. She doesn't do the household chores. She doesn't cook. She doesn't do any of those things. And we see that throughout the movie. And these are all things a good mother's supposed to do, and they're the things we see Snow White doing. So we get this sort of really interesting representation in the 1930s of that dichotomy that supposes that represents what is good and what is bad in motherhood.
Yeah.
And so Snow White is essentially prepped for motherhood at that point in time. What we see in like the 1950s, we had more of those television family shows, right? Where we had Leave It to Beaver and all of that on the TV, and we had the supposed positive representation of the 1950s American TV mom. And we get almost the exact same representation there of what it means to be good and what it means to be bad. And I forget who it was, but in Mediated Moms, they talk about this and they actually list all the characters and things and what it means to be good and bad and in American television during these time periods, particularly for mother figures. That's why it's Mediated Moms. And we actually don't really see a whole lot of differentiation and definitions, even though the
Okay.
1950s was very different from the 1930s in the United States. Um, and then today, you look at today, we had the Me Too movement, we've had all of these other things, and we are just starting to get different representations of motherhood. And by that, I mean they're more complex representations of the biological mother in Disney films. We aren't necessarily getting positive adoptive mothers. We're not necessarily getting positive representation of stepmothers or stepmothers with children or blended families in Disney princess films. But Disney is giving us different representations of family, like you have in Fosters and things like that. So it's this really interesting, all of a sudden, within probably from 2010 to 2020, we got this shift in
Hmm.
Disney of looking at things differently. And Once Upon a Time is a really great portrayal of that because we get all these different mother figures in that time span. And we get a really complex background to a lot of the characters, not only background, but also foreground, like the future, what they could be doing if they were placed in the real world. And we get to see those characters interact outside of their magical land.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And when you were talking, I started trying to think, are there any projects that do put stepmothers in a more positive light? Which is really, really interesting that,
Mm-hmm.
how the company throughout its history has definitely evolved to the types of stories that they're telling, or evolved in the types of stories they're telling. And so I wonder if that is possibly something that's coming in the future. I mean, like right now, where you have a lot of movies don't really feature a set villain.
Mm-hmm.
It's how people are dealing with trauma, and from Disney proper movies,
Mm-hmm.
the animated, the princess movies, to Pixar movies, to even look at the MCU. I mean, the phase
Yeah.
4 of the MCU was all about dealing with trauma and how,
Yeah.
people are dealing with trauma from the end of phase 3 and things like that and moving forward. So another thing that I wanted to know is, and I'm not sure I asked it properly,
Mm-hmm.
why is it that age becomes such a strong factor in, I guess, quote unquote, someone being evil? I mean, we have this fascination in our society with aging, and how um people are supposed to age gracefully,
Mm-hmm.
especially women, the pressure that our society's put on women to age gracefully, and the definitions of how to age. Um, where does that come from? And do these stories, what influence do these stories have on that fascination in our society of like aging?
Right. So that's actually a really interesting question because it's different for men and women.
Hmm.
And by that I mean it's different for those who identify as women who can bear children and things like that. As people who are women presenting, age, we're no longer seen, and this is a terrible thing to say, but we're no longer seen as fertile, and therefore our purpose is no longer
Mm.
needed. And that's, as terrible as that sounds,
Yeah.
that's what my research honestly has led me to believe. It comes down to this really ageist portrayal and really sexist portrayal that women are only needed for childbearing reasons. And that is just, I hate that that's where my research has led me to, but that's where it has led me to. Um, Particularly when I was looking at the Rupert Saunders Snow White and the Huntsman. I know it's not Disney, but the actress who was playing Snow White's mom at the time was oh, her name is Liberty Ross, and she was in her early 30s. She passes away in the film at about 33 years old. In medicine, after a certain age, women are considered high risk for pregnancies.
Hmm.
We're considered geriatric pregnancies. And it's at that point in time that we actually see women on TV screens also age. So it's about the mid 30s. Like I said, like 35 years old, we're no
Okay.
longer deemed, viable. And that's what it's been to look at films and things like that. If a woman's older than 35, she's seen as old. And women in Hollywood who are older, who have quote unquote aged gracefully, have found it difficult to find roles in Hollywood films because they don't
Hmm.
want to cast older women because they're no longer, it's a patriarchal society that they're no longer sexually viable, blah, 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 right? So there's all these reasons that go behind it. And so that's what we end up seeing is that if you don't look young forever, you're no longer considered beautiful or good or anything like that. And that's what we see, like in The Devil Wears Prada, which is, I believe, a Disney film. Um, we get the young Anne Hathaway and Meryl Streep, who was also relatively young, in my opinion, at the time, who's the villain. She's got the white hair, she's thinner, she's what have you. In the Disney princesses, what we see then is the princess is young. Snow White is 13 to 14 years old. Aurora is in her teens. A lot of these other princesses are in their teens, and the villainess is usually older. She's usually beyond childbearing years and is the villain. So not only is she the villain, she's active. She's disrupting the heteronormative familial structure of husband, wife, biological children, the nuclear family, as it were.
Hmm.
And so we see this disruption, and that's why there's a lot of negative portrayal. And women have been fighting those stigmas for eons. And we see a lot. And now we're getting more light into that, where you get to see more um, discussions about pregnancy and things like that with Hollywood, with actresses, with famous mothers, with people talking about pregnancy, people talking about not wanting to have children and
Hmm.
why that's their personal choice and things like that. And that doesn't make them a villain. It's just that's their choice. Women were not put on this earth to have babies. We have other things
Yeah.
to do with our lives. So that's sort of where that ageist perspective comes for women. For men, it's a little different because it's more about power and control, right? It's about the older man usually is senile or he's used as humor in Disney
Hmm.
works, or he's a villain, right? Those are really it for the older man. Once in a while you get a helper, but it's usually a kooky helper, right? He's kind of um a little bit of madness kind of put in with his character where he doesn't get everything out in a straight line, or he speaks in riddles or something like that, like we were talking about the Mad Hatter before we started. And so for them, it's more about the actual process of aging and how it's terrifying, how you can become, you can have dementia and things like that as you get older, and this loss of the physical body and not being able to lift or run or anything anymore because you're getting older
Yeah.
and your body is breaking down. And that is terrifying. But we still don't get really positive. I think Carl from Up is the most positive portrayal I've seen of an older man in a Disney film.
Hmm.
And we get to see that grumpy man kind of break out of his shell. He's been through heartache and pain. He's a really great, complex backstory, and he's not a villain. And the other villain actually is an older man who's
Yeah.
had a very different life and who's more power hungry. And what we get to see is a much better dynamic between two older men and what it means to be good versus bad. And we actually don't get that with women.
Yeah.
Um, so we get this really interesting dichotomy of ageism and sexism, just all kind of balled together.
So, you know what, when you were talking, it made me think of when you started talking about, unfortunately, everything you were saying about female representation in the movies and just kind of in society. Unfortunately, all of that, like, I just kind of like had to sort of nod along with that because
Yeah.
unfortunately that is true.
Hmm.
For men, I've all like, I don't, and tell me if this is incorrect. I've always sort of gotten the impression that whereas the unfortunate stance a lot of society takes is as women get older, they, they're unfortunately, in their positions, but as men get older, they actually gain more control. But you look at, you look at the CEOs of companies, and you look at, like,
Hmm.
um men in different places of power, they tend to be older.
Hmm.
So two questions: one is what I'm saying accurate? And two, what I see represented in movies for women is unfortunately the reality, or unfortunately the way like society views that. But I see kind of a disconnect with the way men are viewed, aging men are viewed in the world versus in the movies.
Hmm.
If that makes sense, please attempt to answer
Yeah,
that.
yeah, no, I know what you mean. So for older men, it's they have control to an extent.
Okay.
When they start to age to like a certain point in time, when they start to have to actually physically use a cane or they have a physical representation of a disability of some sort, that's when they're disempowered. And that's a
Okay.
representation that we get. So we get like the silver fox kind of representation a lot. That is a common representation, but I don't see that as an older man. I see that as a man who's middle age.
Okay.
But that's a personal way that I view age. It's the older man who has a physical, like I said, whether his back's out or he's got a bad knee or something like that and he needs cane or he's like a physical actual manifestation of a disability. That's where you get to see that loss of control because he's losing control over his body. We do get a vast amount of older men who are in control, who like in Avatar, right? One of the villains in the first Avatar, he's this extremely buff army guy with silver hair and a giant scar across his face. And he was older, but he was older to an extent. Like he
Okay.
wasn't a grandfather. He wasn't, if he was, a father, he might have been an older father, but he wasn't like his kids were often married kind of age of a father.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's a different sort of age bracket than what we see with women who are usually in a younger age bracket when they're
Yeah.
considered old. And that's what's really fascinating is men can get older than women in film.
You know,
And women aren't allowed.
one thing that might be really interesting, and I believe it's May 2024,
Hmm.
um, is when the newest Captain America movie comes out. And um, Thaddeus Ross, who
Hmm.
was played by William Hurt, unfortunately
Hmm.
is not played by William Hurt anymore because he passed away,
Hmm.
but he's going to be played by Harrison Ford, who
Yeah.
is, very popular, very well known for, Han Solo, Indiana Jones, a lot of different roles, and has played a lot of different roles as he has gotten older. I mean, he
Hmm.
this last month the fifth Indiana Jones movie came out, you know. It
Yeah.
will, and in that story, he is supposed to be, he is president of the United States at that point. And
Hmm.
so it will be interesting to see how that story is told, because just the way I kind of view it is, you know, if they're using someone like Harrison Ford, they're probably putting a lot of emphasis on that person,
Hmm.
and he's going to be in control. And
Right.
spoiler, I guess, for anybody who who cares about it, Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross, like in the
Hmm.
comics, becomes Red Hulk. So he actually
Yeah.
becomes like this kind of manifestation of raw power and like not knowing how to
Hmm.
control it and everything. That
Yeah.
will be interesting to see how that character is handled, because correct me if I'm wrong, I see that as possibly a different way that an older man is represented in a movie. I don't know if you see it that way or not.
I see it as really interesting, because there's also the view of toxic masculinity that I haven't
Yeah.
talked about yet either, which is, like I said, in Avatar, it's that hyper, like, he had to get really buff. I can't remember the actor's name for the life of me. Can't even remember the character's name. He's the villain. And what we see is that toxic masculinity, where you have to be buff, you have to be in control, you can't cry, you can't have emotions, all of that kind of stuff. And what I see in Captain America then, if they do, if in my head I can see it going one of two ways. In all honesty, with Thaddeus Ross, I can see them Harrison Ford, becoming the Red Hulk, losing power and or having so much power that he loses control of it, which is still that loss of control for an older
Okay.
character.
Yeah.
Or during the experiment, he becomes young and then he loses control. So he becomes a completely different character altogether, so they can put in a new actor. So the way that they did Indiana Jones is they wanted to do this final movie to end it, right? Because Harrison Ford is getting older and they want to be able to get whatever they can out of him before
Yeah.
he unfortunately, right. So I will find it very fascinating. That's basically the two scenarios I can see going on is Harrison Ford, just becoming the Red Hulk within it, or them teasing at the end that Harrison Ford has somehow become younger and is now the Red Hulk, or is going to become the Red Hulk with this younger actor who will then take on.
Okay.
So, which either case I see as somewhat problematic for an ageist portrayal. Like, can we not just have an older character who's complex, who's not necessarily terrible, and he's not necessarily losing control, but complex characters are always nice because then they're not too good and they're not too bad
Yeah.
and they're realistic. And that's what
Yeah.
people are kind of looking for. And I don't think Disney has really hit the mark a whole lot on that, except I think Carl is not a bad exception. But his character does have, it's all about character development for him. And he does go through a pretty interesting character development. Um, so yeah, no, I think Carl would be a good exception.
Okay.
I'm arguing with
And
myself.
you know, I argue with myself all the time. Um, the what's interesting, what you just said, what's interesting about Marvel Comics and the MCU in particular
Hmm.
is, you know, famously in comic books, people don't die. They can
Yep.
be killed off if they're if they need to boost cells, and then they can bring it back when they're you know, they need to be in a new book or cells
Hmm.
are doing poorly. But I've heard a lot of people talk about and Sean Gerber, another friend of the class, he's talked about this a lot on his podcast about MCU fan show, that, you know, as him and his partner have, as as these actors age, you know, they do have to find someone younger to
Yep.
play that role. So that's very interesting what you just said about the possibility of Harrison Ford, you know, becoming younger. So essentially a different person can carry that on as the
Hmm.
stories, you know, keep going. Um, and that also it makes me think of something we talked about before we started recording. What influence do you think, especially animated
Hmm.
features, have on this perception of age? Because when something, when something's animated, it's animated
Hmm.
once, it's not updated. You don't see that character aging. I'm always fascinated with like the social media posts showing like if Disney princesses and princes became parents or as they age, like here, you don't see that in the features, obviously.
Yeah.
What what influence do you think kind of the static nature, the one timestamp of animation has on our views of aging?
I think it's not just aging that it impacts, but it's that representation altogether and that understanding of the film and the social discourse that it brings with it throughout time. It constantly impacts because it's in recirculation all of the time. I mean, we're talking about Snow White. Snow White's being remade, so now it's back in circulation, and so kids are watching again. They're getting ready for the release of the new Snow White film, and what they're seeing is this film from the 1930s that represents that doesn't really truly represent what it means to be. You know, you can never really represent it, but we don't get positive representations of what it means to be a 14-year-old girl and a 30-year-old woman in a society that's technically we're in a patriarchy and in a patriarchal society that the tales were written in. And so we don't actually get that positive representation, but they're viewing it and they're seeing, oh, the wicked stepmother has a secret lair. Within the lair is the first type of book we see in the whole movie, and she reads. How dare she? She studies, alchemy and has an alembic system and is a scientist of sorts. That's villainous,
Mm-hmm.
and whereas Snow White is baking with animals and singing songs and sweeping up and taking care of the dwarves like a good mother would, right? And so they're going to be watching that, and that's going to be back in their heads again, reprinting, rewriting, because when, particularly at those younger age, kids are impressionable, and what they're
Mm-hmm.
viewing helps them understand the world around them. And so they're going to view that and understand the world differently, no matter which way it is. They might look at that and be like, oh, then I have to be like Snow White. You do not have to be like Snow
Yeah.
White unless you
Yeah.
want to be like Snow White. That's the difference. Um, Feminism is about letting women do what they want, right? Um, and men do what they want and equality and all that. But so it's really dangerous to have these still in circulation, but it's also good to have them in circulation because it allows them to then come back up in conversation and to be spoken about and to help big conglomerates like Disney to refocus the film itself, particularly when you're doing adaptations, and how they could maybe change things so that way they're more positive in their representations and to re-alter them. And ageism is part of that and how they're going to
Okay.
reframe it. And I'm very interested into how they're going to reframe the stepmother figure in the 2024 Snow White because we know nothing about it.
Yeah.
We know very little. We just know Gal Gadot is playing the wicked stepmother, and that is it. They've been very tight-lipped about it. I think we've only seen one or two shots from like paparazzi with Rachel Zegler as Snow White, and that's really it. And so I'm very interested to see what they're going to do because from the time before they started, during really early stages and what have you, and even before then, it's been disrupted by the COVID pandemic, and now it's been through the Don't Say Gay bill and all of that in Florida. So it's gonna be really interesting to see what Disney does with this film.
Yeah. Do you think that the Walt Disney Company uses, I mean, you kind of mentioned it, but do you think it's a conscious effort by the company to do live action
Hmm.
adaptations so they
Yeah.
can update those stories to kind of be more closely aligned with the either views today or the way the company wants people to view them?
I have two ideas on that. One is that fairy tales are meant to be adapted to live on and to take on new social
Okay.
discourse and new
Mm-hmm.
representations and things like that, so that way they can be told again in different ways. And so that's why we see them in like young adult literature being rewritten and things like that and taking on different perspectives. The other way that I see it is Disney is a corporation and they have copyright. And when they redo the tales as live action, they get to keep that copyright. They just did that with one of the TV shows was ending and they introduced
Yeah.
Steamboat Willie in so that way they could keep the Steamboat Willie copyright.
Yeah.
And so Disney is very smart when it comes to their copyright.
Hmm.
And I think that's a primary factor in their constant live action remake. I would love for them to do an animated remake of something or even something new in animation because we've gotten a lot of, the 3D animated, what have you, but their live action has been their focus for a while lately, and animation is still an art form. And I think these constant live action remakes are hurting the idea that animation is still an art form and needs to be looked at an art form, and they need to continue to animate like we used to get, and maybe not necessarily the 3D animation that we get in like Tangled and Frozen, but old school 2D animation level.
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
something that a few of us would like to see again, at least once or twice, because it is that nostalgia of our youth coming in. Like we want to see a little bit some more cartoons in the
Yeah.
film.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so no, I think it's two pronged there. I think it's part of the fairy tale living on, and I think it's Disney being a smart business.
And real quick, the what
Mhm,
you're referring to with Steamboat Willie is the copyright for the original version of Mickey
mhm,
Mouse that appeared in Steamboat Willie.
yeah,
That was coming up, and so by introducing a new excuse me, a new product with that, then they're able to extend that copyright and not have it go into the public domain. Um,
right. Like Winnie the Pooh
yeah.
just went into public domain.
Yeah.
Yeah, domain. I can't talk. But yeah,
And
so I'm interested to see what happens with that.
um another thing we talked about before we started recording was you had said you are incorporating or you doing some work dealing with the Mad Hatter
Yeah.
and how the Mad Hatter in the Disney version of
Mhm,
Alice in Wonderland, the first representation of the Mad Hatter was old, kind of like as you're describing, not having as much control. He's sort of manic. He's and then throughout history of that story with the company, he's gotten younger,
mhm,
and to where now he's in some cases even like a romantic interest
mhm.
for Alice the character. Um and that's really that stuck with me. That's really interesting. And why in particular do you think they chose the Mad Hatter for that transformation? Is there another
Mm.
character that they've done similar with? And in particular, have they done that with any female characters?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know if they've done it with any other characters from fairy tales. I can't think of one, and I'm going through the Disney corpus in my head that are based on fairy tales. And yeah, I can't think of one that they've done it with where they've youthened them. I don't think they've done it with female characters. Um,
I mean,
the
because
one
one,
that's in my,
go ahead.
yeah. Oh no, I was just thinking of Jessica Rabbit, and like that's not right.
The one, I don't know, one that I've thought of as Mother Gothel and Tangled, but obviously at the end when she meets her demise,
Mhm.
you see that she was not a young woman.
Right. She was
And
hundreds of years old. Yeah.
yeah, and I don't know if any other representations if they've ever really had that. And
No.
so again, it might be interesting if they do that in the new Snow White movie or how they portray her. But so why did they do that with the Mad Hatter?
They wanted to give Alice a love interest because they
Okay.
wanted there to be a love interest in the tale. And it's something that Um, so things like in fandoms, a lot of fandoms were what they call shipping.
Hmm.
So they were placing their, whether it was their fan fiction or what have you, with their fan creations, they were looking at Alice and the Mad Hatter as love interest. So that was popular. Not necessarily in the 30s, or I'm sorry, not the 30s. Alice was in the 50s, I think it was
I, be-
1951.
I believe so.
Yeah. So I'm not so sure about that, but there were fans. But yeah, so in 1951 it was by Ed Wynn, who was an older actor, he was a comedian. He'd already, he was in Mary Poppins and all of that. I think Mary Poppins came a little later, but he was known for his sort of vaudeville like humor and
Hmm.
act. And so the character of the Mad Hatter was based on him. And so, like I said earlier, that's very close to how I perceived Lewis Carroll's version. But then when we look at other variants of it, more modern variants, I should say, because there are a lot of films on Alice in Wonderland dating back to 1901. I think one's like like 1898 or something like that. It's
Okay.
very old. There's very old versions of it. Disney even did Alice's comedies as some of his
Yeah.
first works.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if the Mad Hatter was in it. I haven't seen them all the way through. But I don't think he was. Anyway, so what we have seen in more modern retellings of the tale, particularly in the 2000s, 2010s, is this love interest has been added because they wanted a romance in there. They wanted a romance
Okay.
plot. They wanted Alice to be an older female. If Alice is a young child, it's a children's movie, right? Because it's based on a child. If Alice is a young woman, they can sell it to different audience. They can sell to the adult audience as well. And there is this sexualization of Alice, and then there's this romance thrown in for, the audience. I want to say female audience is very sexist of me, but they usually put in romances for the women, not so much the men. That was a very gender binary terminology there, but that's basically what it comes down to. And so what we then see is this uh, aging of Alice and this youthening of the Mad Hatter to create this sort of love interest. And in Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, I actually read they were originally supposed to have a kiss, and it was supposed to be a love interest between Johnny Depp's Alice and I can never pronounce her name right, but Mia, the actress, her Alice version, and they got rid of it. So there
Okay.
was a romance in there originally, but there was also a larger age gap there.
Yeah.
And then we have the Alice sci-fi miniseries where they are love interests, they're the closest in age, and then Sebastian Stan's version, there isn't really a love like a romantic love. There's a father and daughter love aspect put in there, but he's the youngest I have seen of the Mattresses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and a couple other things before I want to make sure we get to everything. A couple other things you had mentioned. You are co-editing um
Mhm.
a, a collection on the Frozen phenomenon and also Nightmare Before Christmas. You work heavily with Disnet,
Mhm.
and then so talk about those two things, and then we'll get into our rapid questions.
Sure. The two terms I forgot while I was talking previously about the Mad Hatter and Alice is the male gaze and the female gaze. That's very
Okay.
important part of that. So yeah, the terms just literally popped in my head. I was like, oh, why didn't I say those? But yeah, so I work with two. I'm a co-editor on two collections that will be coming out very soon, hopefully. We're in the final stages. So it's the Frozen Phenomenon collection and the Nightmare Before Christmas, who I work with amazing scholars on that. And they're each sort of coming up with sort of big anniversaries. Frozen's turning 10. The Nightmare Before Christmas is turning 30 this year. I'm very excited about the Nightmare Before Christmas. It came out when I was born, like yay, to age myself. So I'm very excited about that. But yeah, I get to work with a lot of Disney scholarship on that from various aspects, and I get to see a wide range of scholarship in Disney scholars. And so yeah, with the Frozen phenomenon, I'm co-writing a chapter with Sabrina Mittermeier, Dr. Sabrina Mittermeier from the University of Kassel on queerness and Frozen and queering of characters. And we go over a little bit of the Disney and the Don't Say Gay bill and what the Hays Code is and all of that. And then The Nightmare Before Christmas, I am writing a chapter on cultural appropriation and how does a tale of cultural appropriation. It's something that fandoms and fans have been talking about for eons, but there's actually not any academic work that blatantly shows how it can be seen as a fairy tale of cultural appropriation. So I just talk about that. Um, and then, yeah, with DivNet, I am the head of communications, which means I do a lot of stuff. I do the DivNet blog, I run our Twitter and our social media account. And we actually just had a DivNet leadership meeting, which was super fun. And we have a lot of great things coming up, and we're planning all types of amazing events for ECRs, PhDs, academics of all ages, sizes. And creeds. But we are also really excited to be looking at bringing in more people in industry and things like that to DISNet as well, because while we are an academic research-based organization, we are an organization for academics and industry professionals.
Yeah.
So it's very exciting stuff. Yeah, we had our great conference, which you are aware of, and we got to see some really great scholarship there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I had a meeting last week with someone that they are very interested in DisNet, and they reached out about, and I am taking the liberty. It's been announced. People have announced it on social media. I've announced it on social media. So if it's not allowed to say, I'll just edit this out. But you're in early 2025 is the first issue of the International Journal of Disney Studies.
Yes,
And so you you have a lot going on, and
yes.
you're very, very busy
Yeah.
in doing all of this, and so it's awesome that on do you have anything else to say about or anything to say about the International Journal of Disney Studies?
I just had a meeting about that this week too. So we're very excited for it. Our portal for submissions is supposed to be open by the end of the month on Intellect's
Okay.
website. So we're actually really excited. So by September, we should be able to start getting submissions in for our journal, and we're very excited about it. We will be starting to advertise for it. So yeah, you're allowed to say that it
Okay.
exists and that
Okay.
we're doing it. Don't worry about that. Yeah, no, that was me oversight. I've been up since 4 a.m., so my brain is not fully um,
No, no worries.
aware at that moment. But yeah, no, we were really excited about it. We just had, like I said, a meeting about it. I am a commentary editor, so we are looking for, commentaries, book reviews. Book reviews are for with different people, but commentary reviews. So if somebody wants to write, about theme parks, or if they want to write critically about uh, new ride openings or films or what have you, or industry professionals who want to, write about working on a film or a ride or a cast member or something like that. That's kind of where the commentary reviews are. We're very, excited. It's kind of a new area we're trying to explore. But yeah, all kinds of really great stuff happening at Disney.
Yeah, yeah, really, really
Yeah.
cool. But before we get to our rapid questions, is there anything I've missed that you think is important to talk about? Anything else you want to say or concluding remarks on your research and fandom?
Um, no, we've talked about a lot, I think.
Okay, okay,
I'm pretty happy with what we talked about. Yeah.
okay. Then, so these rapid questions, these are ones that I ask, and you can answer and that's it. You can explain if you want. You don't have to explain anything if you don't want. So you ready?
Yeah.
So for first question, favorite Disney resort, and by that I mean I'm talking about Walt Disney World, Disneyland, Disneyland Paris, the actual, the full, not just a park or hotel, but the
Okay.
full resort.
So I've actually only ever been to the one in Florida, and
Okay.
I can never remember if that's Disneyland or Disney World, and I should know it. I don't,
No,
it's terrible.
no worries.
Um,
Walt Disney World
Walt Disney
is
World, right?
and
WDW.
yeah, and in the class, students each semester, probably more than half the students in the class have not been to a Disney park. And if they have been to a Disney park because of our location, they've
Hmm.
probably been to Walt Disney World. I
Yeah,
myself, at the end of July, just made my first trip to Disneyland. Um,
yeah,
that
but
so those are the only two resorts I've ever been to. Okay, so now within Walt Disney World, four
yeah.
parks:
Yeah.
Animal Kingdom, Magic Kingdom, Epcot, Hollywood Studios. Do you have a favorite park?
When I was a kid, it was Animal Kingdom because I loved animals. As an
Okay.
adult, it is Epcot.
Okay. All right.
Much slower pace.
Yeah, yeah. It's the largest walking park,
Yeah.
but so Animal Kingdom is by far the largest part, but
Hmm.
we don't walk much of that as guests.
Yeah.
Um any Disney park, do you have a favorite ride?
So the last ride I remember going on is the Rock and Roller Coaster because it was inside and it was you had the glow in the dark stuff everywhere.
Yeah.
And it just made me really happy to be whizzing around really fast in a bunch of bright lights.
Okay. All right.
Um, it was also air conditioned, so that was like the
Yeah.
top of my
Yeah.
list.
Very important when you're in Hollywood studios, especially depending on what time of the year. Uh,
Yeah.
right now, you definitely need air conditioning to be there. Um, and then last on Disney parks,
Hmm.
do you have a favorite snack in a Disney park?
I'm gonna go with I like the Rainforest Cafe, but I haven't been since I was 16, so it's been a good chunk of years since I
Okay.
was last at a park. I'm supposed to be going to Disneyland Paris next year, so I will obviously have an update.
Okay. All right. So then because you do work dealing with Disney princesses, um, and the perspective of motherhood in those movies, Um, this is a two-part question. Do you have a favorite Disney princess? And do you have a favorite Disney princess mother?
Okay, so no for a favorite Disney princess. I actually,
Okay.
because I analyze them so much, it's so hard for me to have a favorite. Um, it would if it'd be like a tie if I had to choose between Moana, Mulan, and Raya.
Okay.
So some more of the more modern ones, essentially. Um, and then when it comes to mothers, not in a Disney princess line. Um, I think one of my favorite representations of family is Meet the Robinsons, and that's
Okay.
a kind of forgotten Disney movie, but for me that one was really important about found family and good representation of family and the blending of family and how they even have cousins that they're like we have no idea who they're related to,
Yeah.
but they're family now. Like it reminds me very much of the Addams family and how they're kind of like, yeah, we're all family.
Yeah. Yeah. I really, really like Meet the Robinsons, and
Yeah.
especially when the boys were a little younger, we would watch that, and with the quote unquote villain of the
Hmm.
movie, kind of the lesson was, look, depending on how this person's treated, and then like they made the decisions based
Yep.
on how they were treated, and so one lesson is to treat people kindly.
Right.
Another is, if you are not treated kindly, you don't have to make the decisions that this character made.
Right.
Do so I don't Do you have a favorite movie that deals with a Disney princess, or the relationship between a Disney princess and their mother or their surroundings?
Um, I'm thinking of all the Disney princess movies in my head. Uh, if I had to choose, it would the, for me the best one to look at between that dichotomy is, I would say, it's not a favorite, but it's an interesting one to look at, which is the 2015 Cinderella, because we get
Okay.
that extra, we get like 2 minutes of extra dialogue from the wicked stepmother that I found was so crucial to understanding the character and her perspective, that the one chapter I actually wrote shows that Cinderella is kind of a villain in this tale.
Hmm.
Because it showed a really interesting way in which the story can be perceived if we actually looked at it from the stepmother's perspective and not Cinderella's, because everything we see in the Disney princess line is so focused on the princess as the primary character. We don't get to see the mother as the primary character. We kind of do with Disenchanted, because that's the premise of it. But I would like to see an actual Disney princess and her mother at the center of the tale, and they're not fighting each other.
Yeah.
Um, which unfortunately, Merida, they are kind of fighting. Um, so yeah, it's not
Yeah.
really a favorite, but that one I think is a good one to look at that dichotomy.
On that note, what is kind of what's your outlook or take on the Maleficent movies and the relationship between the characters in those movies?
So the Maleficent movies I found really great, because we had a female director who was at the heart of Maleficent. And so what we found then, what we see is this, probably the most positive representation we have of an adoptive mother in Disney, um, which is Maleficent, obviously, and her relationship with Aurora, and how it's very complex, and how at the end it's Maleficent who loves first kiss, because there's no truer, love than a mother and her child. And so to me, that was really fascinating. And that Disney finally has a film where the adoptive parent isn't necessarily wicked, and more of an anti-hero, and who had been, turned because of abuse and things like that, but she was still good at the center of it. And she had been good and she had been wrong. So we actually got a really great character out of that. But there is still problems with the motherhood representation in Maleficent, Mistress of Evil. And I think Rebecca Rowe writes really well about it in one of her articles, which title I can never remember, but it's on Maleficent motherhood. And it's about the good bad dichotomy that we always find mothers in, and how Maleficent could either be good or she could be bad throughout the film. And there's obviously very distinct parts where she is good at the beginning, bad throughout the majority of it, and then good at the end. And she
Hmm.
can't be either at the same time. She has to choose. And so she couldn't be a hero in the film all the way. She had to be evil for a little bit. And so I think she does a really great job. Rebecca Rose does a really great job discussing that. And that was really my main issue with Mistress of Evil, is because we get that Maleficent and the biological mother in comparison, and all of that. Um, and that Maleficent was still viewed as the villain. Anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
I keep going on, but yeah, really interesting. I think it showed a positive step for Disney, but I have not seen positive continued on in other films.
Okay. And the last one, um, and this one's might be a little bit more involved. I'll ask it first and I'll kind of explain.
Okay.
What princess movie would you like to see be made? That could be a fairy tale that has not been adapted by Disney. It could also be an existing fairy tale movie that has been adapted by Disney with a different type of dynamic.
I have so many. Um, So there's like, I have a bookshelf right in front of me that has all these like anthologies of fairy tales that
Yeah.
haven't been touched by Disney. Um, some of them have princesses in them, some of them don't. So there are fairy tales out there that Disney hasn't touched that aren't fairy tale based. I would love to
Yeah.
see some of those. Like maybe a Frahola. That would be good. But I think Disney hasn't really touched the 12 Dancing Princesses. And to me,
Okay.
that would be fascinating because I've seen some really interesting modern takes on it. Um, and so I think that would be a good one to see because Barbie did one, but I've seen more interesting takes in um, young adult fiction and things like that. That would be fascinating. There are a lot of so what we see of Arabian Nights is actually only one of the many tales, and Aladdin is only one of the many tales.
Hmm.
And so while Disney did kind of expand on that a little bit more in the second Aladdin and things like that, we didn't really see a lot of the Arabian Nights. And there's also a lot of Japanese fairy tales that they don't touch. I would love to see more of that because there would be more representation there, particularly for the Asian community. And I think that would be really good. Um, so there's just a lot of things out there that are fairy tale based that aren't maybe Western focused that I would love to see Disney take on and have them take it on with, you know, if it's an Asian fairy tale, an Asian voice at the helm of it as a director or something like that. So we actually get the film that's not necessarily Western centric. So that would be really great for me to see, and was something that I would want them to do because they did that a little bit with Raya and the Last Dragon, and I would love that to be continued on, and that
Okay.
they kind of just stop focusing more on these live action remakes of films they've already done. Um, and maybe I would like to see a slightly different retelling of um the Black Cauldron. I think that film deserves more hype than what it got. I think Atlantis deserves more hype than what it got. Um, so yeah, I would love to see just kind of a revamp, not like a remake, but just like a revamping of look at these films that we did, like come see them. They might not be
Okay.
very tale based, but yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for doing this.
Hmm. Of
And
course.
um, for anyone who wants more information, what's the best way to get in touch with you, B?
So I am on Twitter. My Twitter is, oh gosh, if I can remember it. It's BELDRIDG39 at, I believe, I'm sorry, it's not Twitter anymore, X. Um, but I'm there. I'm on Facebook. I'm on academia.edu, under Brittany Eldridge. That's my official name. Um, I'm also on Disnet's website. You can find me there. I have the Disnet blog Gmail. So your blog idea for Disney, you can always email disnetblog@gmail.com. It's up on the Disnet website. Yeah, so I'm sort of everywhere. I also run the Disnet Twitter, so you can always find us at underscore Disnet, Disnet. So yeah, I'm just sort of everywhere.
Okay. Well, awesome. And again,
Yeah, of
thank you for doing this. This is
course.
really, really great information. I
Yeah,
learned a ton from this. I hope
I'm
other
glad.
people listening and watching um, enjoyed it. And thank you very much, B. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Hi.